Thank you, and welcome to my presentation, Ethical Considerations for Financial Counseling with Formerly Incarcerated Individuals. My name is Courtney Howard. I am an AFC candidate. I also do work with formerly incarcerated individuals. So first, we'll talk about the different communities that financial counselors may work with. We'll then discuss the importance of maintaining self-awareness. We'll talk about enhancing cultural competencies. Then we'll understand some of the barriers that are faced by members of this community. And finally, we'll talk about how to advocate for the needs of formerly incarcerated individuals. So not a lot of us work regularly with former prisoners, but if you were to encounter a client like this, are you prepared to work with them? I want to make sure that you are. Financial counselors work with many different types of communities. We may work with geographically specific groups, such as those belonging to a certain city or neighborhood. We may work with gender-specific advocacy groups, such as organizations that work with cis and trans women and girls. Some of us work with military communities or faith-based organizations. Some work with small business owners or first-time homeowners. We can work with very high income earners or very low income earners. But for the purpose of this presentation, we'll discuss those of us who may at some point in our careers work with formerly incarcerated individuals. So there are a number of ethical considerations to keep in mind when you're working with members of this population. And one of those is maintaining self-awareness. When you think of the images or the stereotypes that are attached to that of a prisoner, what comes to mind? What stereotypes does society attach to prisoners? You can raise your virtual hand and I'll call on a couple of you. You can also put it in the chat.
Rough people.
Rough people, drugs.
Yeah.
Honest, dangerous, deadbeat, brought this on themselves. Tattoos. Lower education or extremely wealthy. Okay. We have irresponsible, it's going really fast. No fathers, uncivilized. Misguided. Okay. Not trusting of others, irresponsible, intimidating, lifetime criminal. Okay, so we see that we have a lot of very negative connotations associated with prisoners, and we are typically conditioned to think of them in a very negative way. So we want to ensure that we understand how we're conditioned to think of prisoners and keep that in mind so that we can mitigate the impact of stereotypes on members of this community. So a quote that may resonate with many financial counselors is that self-awareness that permits a financial counselor to better understand how their past experiences and events have influenced their current beliefs and behaviors encourages empathic communication and serves as the foundation of a strong therapeutic alliance. This strong therapeutic alliance is essential for building trust and transparency with your client, and this is necessary to have the best counseling outcomes. So one way to ensure this is to be aware of your client's transference. Transference is when a client transfers their feelings associated with a past event or person to that of their financial counselor. An example of this could be when a client expects a counselor to be very judgmental because they had a very judgmental mother growing up. The client may react to the counselor in a very negative way because they are expecting the counselor to be very critical of them. You also need to be aware of your own countertransference. And this is when you, as the financial counselor, transfer your feelings onto the client. In the context of counseling formerly incarcerated individuals, an example could be if a client reminds you of someone who committed a crime against a loved one, and you find it extremely difficult to extend empathy and compassion to that client. So transference and countertransference do blur the professional boundaries, and they interfere with counseling outcomes. And it's important to be aware of how these reactions are impacting the counseling process. Other ways to maintain self-awareness include using Project Implicit's implicit association test to measure implicit biases. Implicit biases are negative attitudes that occur automatically and unintentionally, and they can influence judgments, decisions, and behaviors, and may impede the counseling process. So knowing where you fall along this measure of implicit biases is a good place to start to begin to address this area of concern. You can also seek feedback through work performance evaluations. These can be conducted by a manager or a supervisor. You can have your clients complete a survey after services have been rendered. You can even do self-assessments. You can also engage in self-observation by reviewing your own sessions through audio or visual recordings. It is important to note that this can only be done with the client's prior written consent. Our standards of practice 14 for the AFCPE is permission to record or observe. Counselors must obtain prior written consent from clients in order to record electronically or observe sessions. However, this is a very effective way to gain some insight into your own behaviors and recognize some of your verbal cues or tics or other signs of anxiety as you view yourself through the lens of your client. Counselors can also engage in introspective exercises. If this is completed immediately following a session, it'll help you keep track of your reactions and feelings. And then anyone in a helping profession is encouraged to seek their own form of counseling. This will help you deal with transference and countertransference and proactively address these areas. You can also prioritize self-care. We are prone to feelings of burnout, exhaustion, anxiety, depression. These are all indications that you need to begin prioritizing self-care. So other ethical considerations include enhancing our cultural competencies. And again, I would like for you to kind of consider what it means to be culturally competent. When I say cultural competencies, what comes to mind? You can type it in the chat or raise your virtual hand and I'll call on a couple of you.
Everybody's typing at once, you know, that's how that works. An awareness of other cultures, right?
Awareness of other cultures, definitely. Understanding where people,
There, we got a whole bunch coming. See, they all come at one time. That's how that happens.
Yeah, understanding where people are coming from, being open to learning about new or different cultures than our own or what we were raised in. Definitely not always looking at things through personal lenses. Understanding where someone is coming from, how their experiences influence them, considering people's backgrounds, being aware of how others relate, and appreciation of differences. I think it's the ability to adapt to other ways of doing things that matter, inclusive or of experiences outside of your own. So we also have understanding underlying differences within cultures that influence their interactions with others and their own biases, able to relate and be open to hear and learn others' perspectives. So just for the interest of time, I'm going to say yes. Thank you so much for sharing. These are all excellent. Thank you so much. So when we consider enhancing cultural competencies, the elements of cultural competence include
I got it.
Include valuing diversity, conducting self-assessments, managing the dynamics of difference. So in the beginning, I said that counselors work with many different types of communities. but we also are very different from our clients. We may be of a different race or gender or socioeconomic status. Also, acquire and institutionalize cultural knowledge. So this involves the intentional consumption of cultural information through various means, such as attending community events or meeting culturally diverse people, or consuming this information through various media outlets. We also need to adapt to diversity and the cultural context of the communities we serve. So again, working with these different communities, if you're working with a group of teenagers who are preparing for their financial futures, the services you provide will look very different from working with a low-income family that's preparing to purchase their first home. Oh, and then these elements of cultural competence encompass our standards of practice 1, which is non-discrimination. Counselors respect diversity and must not discriminate against clients because of age, color, culture, disability, ethnic group, gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, marital status, or socioeconomic status. And standards of practice 18, continuing education. Counselors must engage in continuing education to maintain their professional competence. And definitely everything shared in the chat was reflected in all of this. So thank you for that. So also to enhance cultural competencies, we need to understand the impact of systemic barriers. Systemic barriers are policies, practices, or procedures that collectively impact a group disproportionately and create or perpetuate significant disparities in outcomes. So these disparities can manifest as income disparities, quality of education and healthcare disparities, the opportunities that we may be presented with, or even access to various resources in our communities. These disparities do exist because of the systemic barriers that are encountered by certain marginalized communities. We also need to understand how power and privilege are differentially attached to various social constructs. So a social construct is a concept that exists not in objective reality, but it exists as a result of human interaction. It exists because we as humans agree that it exists. And as humans, we tend to conflate difference and deficiency. So someone who is different from you may somehow be inferior or superior to you. If we understand how power and privilege are attached to these different social constructs, we can mitigate the impact of the negative impact associated with these things. So again, they include gender, race, ethnicity, education, religious or spiritual affiliation. The AFCPE AFC Code of Ethics tells us to recognize our limitations and refer clients when appropriate. We as counselors need to always be able to extend unconditional positive regard to our clients. Unconditional positive regard allows a financial counselor to fully accept a client who may share thoughts, feelings, or behaviors that are considered morally wrong or unacceptable. So this is especially important when working with formerly incarcerated individuals, because you may encounter a client who has committed a crime that you are morally opposed to. And you do need to assess whether, as the counselor, you can extend unconditional positive regard to this client. And if you're unable to do so, then you need to refer this client to another counselor who will be able to do that. So just by a show of thumbs up or thumbs down, if you were to encounter a client who committed a crime that you're morally opposed to, how many of you would feel comfortable working with that client right now? You can just use the thumbs up, thumbs down reaction. I see some thumbs down, and okay, it's pretty equal. So both. So some of you are comfortable and some would find it pretty difficult, which is completely understandable. So now let's discuss the barriers that are faced by formerly incarcerated individuals. They cannot vote.
We do have one hand raised. I don't know if we want to hit that before we start.
Oh, sure. Kathy, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Real quick, that is a very introspective question. I didn't know how to answer it because it was like I'd really have to think about that. So just wanted to add that. I didn't want to do a thumbs up or thumbs down because that I've never been approached with that question. So thank you for that.
Definitely. And again, I think that not a lot of us work with formerly incarcerated individuals. So all of a sudden having to work with a client who may come with some baggage that we're not used to may be a little bit difficult. So it is important to consider. So the barriers that are faced by members of this community, there's a disproportionate rate of unemployment. 27% are unemployed compared to just 4% for the national average. A 2021 study found that after being released for 4 years, a third of formerly incarcerated individuals still did not have a job. There is often substantial debt related to legal cases. Sometimes as much as 60% of their income is committed to legal debt. They also have difficulty accessing banking options and often a lack of credit or poor credit due to being unable to meet their financial obligations during their period of incarceration. So how can we advocate for the needs of these individuals? Well, we need to prioritize their goals based on the greatest need. Housing may be the greatest need that must be immediately addressed, but usually it is not the greatest need because many prisoners are released to intimate partners or relatives or some form of transitional housing facility, and therefore getting a job and earning an income is likely going to be the greatest need that must be addressed. To help your client find employment, it is important to encourage them to get job training and create a resume to reflect employment history as well as skills gained while in prison. Prisoners can often engage in various courses of study or skill building programs while they're in prison. So all of this needs to be reflected on their resumes. They can also utilize resources such as Career One Stop, Center for Employment Opportunities, local United Way 211 services, or findhelp.org. These will offer additional job training and employment resources and other forms of financial assistance. Your client should also gather or replace important documents such as a birth certificate, a driver's license, or a social security card in order to get a job. If these documents were lost or stolen or destroyed somehow, they can be replaced through USA.gov. And then your client should have 3 references readily available from non-relatives. And this can include a social worker, a parole officer, or a former manager. Your client can also utilize other resources. One of them includes the Bend the Box initiative. This is a movement that has been adopted in 37 states and over 150 cities and counties. This movement removes the checkbox that will ask an applicant if they have a criminal history. And so it eliminates discrimination prior to a background check so that formerly incarcerated individuals with relevant skills can be initially considered for employment. It is important to note that having a criminal background, criminal history, can still prevent your client from receiving a job offer, but it does eliminate that initial barrier that they face of even being considered if they do have the relevant skills for a certain position. They can also choose to find employment with one of over 100 companies that have signed a Fair Chance Pledge. These are companies that have made a commitment to give a second chance to formerly incarcerated individuals. And there are some large companies in here. We have Facebook, Walmart, Google, Prudential, Starbucks, Uber, Under Armour. So your client can choose to find employment with one of these companies to have a better chance. Additional resources that are specifically for formerly incarcerated individuals includes hirefelons.com and jobsforfelonshub.com. Then your client needs to focus on gaining access to banking, and they need to do this by shopping around for the best terms, asking about account minimum, monthly or yearly fees, transaction fees, and overdraft fees. Your client can also use second chance banking opportunities. These are institutions that offer second chances to people who have been rejected because of problematic banking history. Your client may have to pay a monthly fee for this type of account. It may require a direct deposit, and they may even have to complete a money management course. But this type of account can usually be upgraded to a regular account after a successful period of wise financial decision making by paying their bills on time and keeping their credit utilization low. Chime, Green Dot Bank, Barrow, and Wells Fargo do offer second chance banking. And then we need to focus on finding affordable housing. So formerly incarcerated people are 10 times more likely to be homeless. Relatives and intimate partners, homeless shelters, or residential reentry centers, which are also called halfway houses, can offer transitional support. If your client does have this transitional support during this time, then this is the time that they should be focusing on finding permanent affordable housing. Permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing are forms of government housing that offer long-term solutions. The permanent supportive housing is funded by the Federal Housing and Urban Department. If your client is facing any barriers due to credit issues, they can be encouraged to use a credit counseling service. These nonprofit organizations will help your client tackle debt and fix credit to improve the odds of being approved for affordable housing. And they may encourage your client to obtain a credit builder loan or a microloan. A microloan is a small loan of $100 or $300, something like that, that can be paid back in small manageable increments over an extended period of time. Your client can also get a secured credit card, which will require a deposit. And all of these options are going to help them build or repair their credit. They can also utilize other forms of government assistance. TANF is temporary assistance for needy families. SNAP benefits will help with food. LIHEAP is low income home energy assistance program, which will help with utility costs. Your client can also, if your client qualifies for this program, your client can use the NACA home purchase program. NACA is Neighborhood Assistance Corporation of America. And this program eliminates the barriers to affordable home ownership. They don't require a down payment, closing costs, PMI, or fees, and they offer below market fixed rates. This organization also offers counseling to help your client, to prevent your client from being house rich and cash poor. So not only do they help your client get into a home, but they also help your client keep that home. And then the National Housing Law Project serves as an advocacy resource for housing justice by enforcing the rights of tenants and preserving and expanding the nation's supply of safe and affordable homes. So this is an additional layer of protection if your client is facing any obstacles to finding permanent affordable housing. And I see I have a lot of things in the chat.
Lots of discussion, really just lots of discussion about people who have seen that kind of stuff. So not really questions, more comments.
Okay, so are there any questions?
Ooh, look at that.
Yes, it is very, applicable to many marginalized communities.